Welcome. I'm Meghan O'Rourke with CCTV, Town Meeting Television, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Ben Kinsley and Pam Mackenzie from Campaign for Vermont. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm going to ask you just to introduce what is Campaign for Vermont and your roles there and a little bit about who you are. Let's start with you, Ben.
Sure. Yeah, so Campaign for Vermont started in 2011 as an organization focused on creating prosperity for Vermonters all around the state of all walks of life, growing the middle class, and doing that through a variety of policy levers. So whether that's tax policy, economic development policy, education policy, bringing folks together in the community to talk about those issues, identify solutions, and then bring those solutions to the legislature and have policy conversations about them and what levers should be pulled. And so we've done a lot of work in a lot of different areas, as you can imagine. That's a pretty broad scope. And so we've touched a lot of things, most recently education policy. But we also believe that government should be, both state and local, should be open and transparent, and we believe that increases public confidence in state government and local governments. And the result of that is, one, better policy making, but also you get more buy-in from the public, and we believe that's important to outcomes. And my role, I've been working with the organization since about 2012, 2013, both as a policy analyst and then later on as a board member, and now as executive director. I came back 2 years ago to fill that role. And, like I said, we've been really focused on a lot of issues. The headline one right now in the last 2 years has been education policy, and working through what that is going to look like going forward.
Tell us a little bit about you, who you are.
Sure.
And what draws you to this work, which is probably under the surface very exciting and interesting, but has a
veneer of
dry, yeah.
Yeah, dry. So I grew up in Vermont, lifelong Vermonter, with a couple stints in New York and Boston in the mix there. But I went to school for public policy, came back and was looking around at what did I want to do with that skill set, and found Campaign for Vermont along the way, and discovered that I really like solutions-oriented, data-oriented policy work. And I had moved to, left the organization for a little bit for personal economic reasons, but I came back specifically because of that, because I was in a position where I want to feel like I'm contributing to something meaningful, and Campaign for Vermont is the right place to do that for me. So,
thanks, Pam Mackenzie. You've just taken over the president. Mm-hmm. The role of president. Mm-hmm. Explain to us a little bit about what that role is and a little bit about who you are.
So first of all, we are really fortunate that Ben has been with us forever, it seems like. I was first introduced to Campaign for Vermont when I went to work for one of the founders. The founders were Bruce Listman, Mary Alice Mackenzie, and Tom Pelham. And I went to work for Bruce when he was running, he left an active role at Campaign for Vermont and was running in the primary against now Governor Scott. And that's when I was introduced to the organization. And stayed in contact, stayed involved, and stayed distantly watching what was going on, but have always been impressed by virtue of the fact that it's just the facts, ma'am. It's black and white, and it's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's not progressive. It is, here's the data. And that's really what the gift that we provide and that I admired, frankly, because I'm data-driven. My background, I came to Vermont in 2009 to run Comcast. And I was in telecom for 35 years and was there for 2 years, and they asked me to take the same job in another state. I politely declined because I had fallen in love with Vermont and decided to start a consulting company, and the rest is history. The gift was being reintroduced to an active role at Campaign for Vermont, and how exciting to be asked to serve as president and work with people as smart and as talented and as gifted as Ben and the other folks that either volunteer or serve on our board. We have 20,000 members. And a board of directors and a board of advisors, and we're in the process of working together with them to see what next steps are for 2027, and working very closely with the founders on that as well.
One of the things that Campaign for Vermont talks about itself is this idea of being nonpartisan. And there was some challenges to that when Bruce Listman chose to run for governor as a Republican and had made some contributions. Just talk about why that's important. We're in such a system where you have to be politically aligned, it seems, to get things done. Why? What does that mean for you? What is that? Why is that important? And how do you safeguard that?
I'm going to take this. No, I'm going to take this one because I watched it, and the legislature this past season, there was a significant amount of focus on the Senate and the House side on education, and it came to be that literally every day of the that the legislature was in session, Ben was testifying in either a House or a Senate Education Committee because it was just the facts. They trusted him. And that's fundamentally what Campaign for Vermont is about. We get to the point where people understand we're not affiliated with, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with any of the political parties in our state, but we're not affiliated, associated with, beholden to any of the political parties. We're funded separately, and the research that is done and the numbers and the facts that are produced are just the facts, ma'am. It's black and white. That's what I wear.
Yeah, you are.
I think two things I would add to that. One is, yes, our approach comes from a place of curiosity. We're very careful when we, look at grant money or any sort of funding that has a string attached to it, because we want to maintain editorial control and not have some sort of predetermined outcome whenever we take a bit of funding, and that's why. 99% of our funding comes from in-state philanthropy and folks who buy into our mission. And for us, I think, if I was going to sum it up, I would say our view of being nonpartisan comes from a belief that good ideas can come from anywhere. Doesn't matter what political banner is associated with that idea. If it's the right policy and it meets the goals that we all share, it doesn't matter who's proposing it. It matters. The policy itself is what matters.
Can you bring us into that thinking in a concrete, grounded way around education reform? And what were some of the facts that you all were sharing? What were your legislative priorities? And I guess along with that is, how do you decide on those legislative priorities? Where's that decision making coming from?
Yes, we're going through that right now for next year, right? As we're trying to figure out what are the big priorities, what are the things that we invest our time and energy into. And we have a really great group of folks on our board and our advisory council, which has increasingly been an important tool for us over the last couple of years. A really great group of folks that are giving us guidance on the areas we should be focusing on that advance our mission. And to answer your question about how do we apply that in a concrete area, education policy is very complex, so there's some complexity. I'm going to oversimplify it to some degree for the purposes of our conversation today. But you know, the way that we approached that is, okay, before we get to a prescription, whether that is school consolidation or you know, rebalancing the number of teachers or capping education costs, like these are all sort of things that had been talked about, right? Before we even get there, let's understand what are the dynamics that are happening in our schools and how did we get there? And something when we started looking at the data, two things jumped out at us pretty quickly. One is that there's actually we did a regression analysis on all of the schools districts in the state.
What does that mean?
It's a statistical analysis that tells you what the relationship between two variables might be.
Okay.
And so we did that looking
like class size and pupils declining.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we looked at class sizes, we looked at the total size of the school district, we looked at the cost per student in a couple different ways of looking at cost per student. We realized pretty quickly that there is no statistical relationship between the size of the school district and the cost per pupil. Mm-hmm. And there also is no relationship between the size of the school district and the outcomes based on standardized test scores. So when you start realizing that, you're like, okay, well, consolidation then doesn't really make a lot of sense because the bigger districts are not actually performing better on these two metrics that most people would care about. So what does? And so that led to a whole lot of things. But one of the key things that led us to is we realized that you know, leading up in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Vermont was pretty in line with the national average in terms of the cost per student. And we were slightly ahead of the national average in terms of outcomes. What happened is as soon as Act 60 passed, which put in the yield funding formula that we have today, our cost per student numbers started growing significantly. And in fact, we outpaced the national average by a factor of 2 over the past 30 years that funding formula has been in place. Whereas the prior 30 years, we were right at the national average and we were trending at the national average, even though our outcomes were better. So that led us back to the funding formula is the most important thing we've got to change. A lot of the conversation around consolidation and you know, putting hard caps on things, we viewed that there are some legitimate conversations to have there, and some of that data and the data we looked at from the Act 46 consolidations that we saw a decade ago, we looked at those as well to try to find, okay, maybe there are some consolidations that need to happen, but overall that is not the strategy to get costs down in the way that policy makers and state leaders were looking to. And really, it's the funding formula changes that are the thing that are the core aspect of what needs to change. And so we brought that to the legislature. We brought all the different data points that we had found. And we've done that really for the last 2 years in various ways. And you know, this year they passed a bill that was pretty in line with the findings that we had. And a number of folks, particularly in the Senate, we're very appreciative of the information that we brought because it really felt like there was a vacuum of information around what to do with schools. And
what are some of the sources of that data that you all are pulling from? I mean, I know the auditor's done some investigation of, you know, school spending and outcomes, and so who else is producing data that Vermonters rely on to make decisions?
so most of that data comes from the Agency of Education.
Okay.
Whether or not the agency looks at their own data before they start making recommendations is a little bit of an open question, but I think they're doing so more now than they have in the past, particularly when it comes to outcomes. Like the agency, I think we will see over the next 6 months is really focused on outcomes and what we've seen from the decline in outcomes in the last decade for our students, and so I'm encouraged to see them focusing on that. So that's a big place that we look at for data from. There's also the National Center for Education Statistics. That's a big source of data that basically all policy organizations across all 50 states look at that as sort of a single point of truth when they're comparing state to state education trends. So we look at that quite a bit as well. And then the final source of data that helped craft some of the policy recommendations around governance that we saw implemented this year, and the Education Task Force last year was looking at similar data, is case studies that other states have done around how do you sort of maintain these small school district units but gain efficiencies of scale through shared services. And there's a lot of case studies out there on that. And so you know, we looked at a lot of those last year as we were sort of crafting policy recommendations around how do you get efficiencies out of a small rural state with an education system that's built around that, without having to put kids on a bus for 2 hours a day. So like, because that's also kind of
avoid closing schools and consolidating schools, and that's where we ended was. And forgive us if we're going into the weeds here a little bit.
We're getting dangerously close to the weeds.
We're in the weeds. But it's important stuff. And I wonder just if you can talk a little bit about how Campaign for Vermont understands the foundation formula.
Sure.
And do you take positions on things like that, or are you...
So as a general concept, we think the foundation formula is the right direction. Directionally, 2/3 of states use some variation of a foundation formula.
And you got to tell people what that is.
So the way to think about a foundation formula is that the state writes a check to every school district on a per student basis. So whether that is $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a student, state writes a check. That check is usually weighted a little bit. So there's most states will weight it so that if you have a higher poverty rate than the average school district, you get a little bit more on a per student basis than the average school district might. So there's usually 5 or 6 factors that most states look at. And then if the district wants to spend more than that, more than the foundation amount that is provided by the state, they can do that, but it's on their own tax base. So you have a statewide tax rate, and then you have a local.
So we're eliminating the Act 60, like collecting all those taxes, putting them in a pool, and then distributing them.
And distributing them, because the problem that system has created is that if Burlington increases, I'll pick on Burlington because I live in Burlington, so Burlington increases our school spending, it impacts its tax rates in Brattleboro in the yield formula that we have today, where it all pools and then gets distributed out. If the state is deciding here's the floor, and then you can spend above that if you want. Now, part of the big debate in Vermont is, and will be over the next 2 years, how much above that base amount our district's going to be allowed to spend, because it shouldn't be infinite, because then you run into some issues that Act 60 was trying to solve, is if one district can spend twice as much as another district, that causes an equity problem. So like, how much above that base foundation amount districts are allowed to spend is going to be a big topic of debate. And also those weighting factors that I mentioned for poverty or English language learning or what have you, those are also going to be a big source of debate, because those are picking winners and losers between school districts, and people are going to feel strongly about that. And whether a particular weighting factor is advantaging one district and disadvantaging another one, those are going to be difficult conversations to have. So we have not necessarily taken a position on those finer details yet. That is some of the work we're going to be doing over the next year, is to understand what's best practice from other states, what makes sense for Vermont's context. But the foundation formula for us clearly is the direction we should be going, and those finer details will be fleshed out over the next couple of years.
Yeah. One of the things that we have on the screen, and we can't see it right now, but is the word prosperity. And in the political arena right now, the word affordability keeps coming up. And I feel sometimes, as somebody who's not a wealthy Vermonter, grew up thinking it's my job to pay taxes comfortably and not worry about it. It's like that's what we do, right? That we're kind of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic over and over and over again. And how do you apply the concept of prosperity in such an inequitable system while talking about maintaining conversations around equity, paying attention to community needs, and not kind of getting sucked into this affordability black hole?
Yes.
And this sounds like a very pointed question. It's really not. And Pam, jump in here. I see you having some thoughts. Yeah.
I think about how I was raised and the area that I was. One of 4 kids. My dad was in the service. We ended up in South San Francisco, California, and we knew what we want as a family, what we wanted to buy a home. And so the kids decided, and my mom said, I'm going to go to work and I'm going to support what your dad's doing, but the money that I'm going to make is going to give us the opportunity to buy a home. And we saw that as prosperity. It was never about affordability. And so the goals were set in the home. And I don't know if I'm missing something, but I do know that there are enough folks that we deal with in our community, even in South Burlington, where affordability is a big issue. And there are organizations that have been created to help with providing their food. Hunger-Free Vermont, providing their housing, providing, transportation for their young people to get to school, getting them to school. And that I don't remember, honestly, going on.
Growing up.
Yeah, when I was growing up. So that's the difference for me. I don't know.
I think it
where you
feels
are.
different for me too. It feels like there's so many more families in our community today that are struggling to make ends meet.
And we have data points.
And we have data points.
4,000 Vermonters. The number of folks who live without a home has doubled since the pandemic, and those numbers may not be exact, but there are 4,000
I think that's
Vermonters
pretty close. Yeah.
who live without homes right now.
And I think the number of I think another important factor to keep in mind, 2 things actually, is the number of Vermonters that are living paycheck to paycheck, that are one disaster away from having to make some really tough decisions. And the same thing for folks that are housing burdened, that are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, and that's over 50% of Vermonters already today. So I think that those things, when you talk about I think you're right, and what you're sort of getting at is affordability is a little bit of a one-dimensional thing, whereas, prosperity is not just surviving, it's thriving, and that's the goal, is that everyone is thriving, or as many people as we can get to thriving as possible. Another, perhaps a more trendy way to talk about that is abundance. Right, that's the term that has been used more often in today's vernacular, and it's the concept of there's enough to go around. It's not just that we're fighting over how do we divvy up a shrinking pie, which gets to I think the point you're making about equity is how do we maintain equity when a pie is shrinking, when the economy is shrinking, when there's less resources to go around. It's really difficult to do.
Well, the economy is imbalanced. It's not shrinking, right? Wealth is growing exponentially. And I don't know what that is in Vermont. So talk a little bit about that. If there's enough to go around, is it a redistribution of wealth? and we can get esoteric, but you can also turn it into what are your legislative priorities next year?
Right? Yeah. What is it?
You want to come back to
No,
you want to come back to the grounded element. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It gets when you have an economy. So there's a macro thing happening in the United States in general, where there is a lot of wealth being created, and it's concentrated at a very high income level, right? Most of that wealth generation is at a very specific socioeconomic class. But that's a little different than the story of what's happening here in Vermont. So you have these two dichotomies where, like, our economy is relatively stagnant here in Vermont. It's not really growing that much. It's certainly not keeping up with inflation or the cost of living component. So the affordability kind of comes into that when you have an economy that's not really growing, but the costs keep going up. That's when you start hearing folks talk about affordability. And then you have this other thing that's happening at the national level. And there's a whole lot of stuff, nationally that we could talk about. For us and our purposes, we're focused on what's happening in Vermont. And, there is some interplay with federal policy for sure.
A third of Vermont's budget relies on federal funding. So,
yes. Yeah. So like what's going on at the federal budget level does impact our state. Federal policy impacts our state. We saw that really explicitly with the cross-border issues we've seen over the last couple of years. Like, that impacts Vermont. Our tourism numbers are down from Canada, and that's a big part of our economy. And so there are definitely things that impact from a federal policy standpoint. For our organization, as a Vermont-based organization and a Vermont policy organization, we're focused on what Vermont policies can we impact, understanding there is some interplay with the federal government. But I think from that perspective, if we're able to grow the economy or create economic opportunities for folks, making sure that the benefits of that get shared equitably, right? So we're not just figuring out how to divvy up a pie that's essentially shrinking. It's trying to grow the pie and making sure that growth goes to the places it needs to go.
So in the upcoming legislative, so we just finished biennium, we're going to have some new legislators possibly in. There will be some new legislators because there's a lot of folks who have who are not going back. What are the Campaign for Vermont's priorities, and do you take a position on sort of the new tax? Like, are there new revenue generation pathways that you think we need to be exploring?
Well, the major one that we know is going to be a big priority for the next year or so is going to be turning around the trends that we're seeing in our pre-K through 12 education system. We've fallen from top 5 in the country 10 years ago to middle of the pack, or worse than middle of the pack, depending on how you look at it. And that is a huge equity issue. When we look at the opportunity for the next generation of Vermonters, we need to be focused on that and making sure that they have the tools to succeed and thrive here in Vermont. So that is a big piece of it for us.
And help me understand, because in my narrow view of it, the legislature can affect the costs, maybe some policies around things like sanctuary schools, like our schools a safe place for kids to show up and be, maybe around, but like, how do we affect outcomes, education outcomes from a legislative
perspective?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about setting up the right systems and the right accountability mechanisms to make sure that, basically, to a certain degree, it's more setting expectations than it is actual changes in policy. Because there's some of these things are in-state policy today. But setting very clear expectations. Here's what we expect our schools to be able to do. How we educate our students. What we expect from our students in terms of their ability to go out into the world and be prepared for that. And then the mechanism that's really mostly missing in today's ecosystem is the mechanism to hold people accountable to that.
Bingo.
To say, like, are you meeting those targets? Are you not meeting those targets? If you're not meeting them, are you making progress towards them?
So do you support an accountability commission in the legislature? Is that something that?
It could be in the legislature. It could be an extension of what the Agency of Education does. It could be an extension of what the State Board of Education does. There's other mechanisms that other states have used, including next door in Massachusetts, where if a school system is not performing at the expected level, and they are not making progress towards that, they get a written warning, and then after a certain period of time, the state will actually come in and take over that school district, take it away from the superintendent and the school board, and they'll put it into receivership. And that is a very tough accountability system. We don't necessarily need to go full into that, but just having that system of evaluating and being really clear how are we progressing towards these goals that have been set at the state level.
Pam, are there priorities that you have taking over this leadership role for Campaign for Vermont that you want to see moving forward?
We put together a strategic plan and went back to our advisory committee and our board of directors. And Ben did an exceptional job putting together the facts and figures for each of the different items that he knew were going to be coming up either through the legislature or the general public. And they chose 3, and education was one, ethics was one, and housing. And I don't think that there is anyone that has said, oh, you picked the wrong ones. They absolutely are. And from a housing perspective, if we want to talk about affordability, think in terms of what I paid for my home in 2009 versus what the people across the street sold exactly the same home for 5 weeks ago. And, woohoo, I made the right investment, and you have to have a significant income now in order to be able to buy a home. And that's not where I want to live, frankly. I want us to be able to have the opportunity for people that have just gotten married and are planning a family, that type of thing, to be able to want to be here, have the ability to buy a home and invest for their kids and go to a school where they know that they're going to get a really good, solid, fundamental education. And I'm past time, I'm sorry.
You're not past time.
Oh.
This is community media. We get to go.
You get to go as long as you want.
As long as we want.
Woohoo!
I think
We get to go, so we don't cut us, Kevin doesn't cut us off.
I think something important in the housing conversation, I mentioned earlier that the percentage of Vermont families that are cost burdened by housing. The other important thing to keep in mind is that the grand list values, the property values, during the pandemic, and even we're still seeing some of it today, we're growing at 10% a year. And so not only are over half of Vermonters cost burdened by the current housing stock, that housing stock is continuing to get more expensive at a rate that is unsustainable, and clearly is out.
How many communities haven't done reassessments to change their tax?
None.
Well, they're all. How many of them have done reassessments for their
How
property
many
value?
still have property value reassessments to do that
a
will
lot of them.
impact tax?
A lot of them.
Yeah.
And the challenge becomes, like, not only is it already a problem today, it's a target that's moving away from us faster than we're pursuing it. Like, if you have housing costs that are growing at 3 times the rate that incomes are growing at, that's a big problem, especially when already half of your households can't really afford the housing that they're in comfortably. And so we need to solve that problem. That is a big problem that we need to solve when it comes back to the just people being able to survive in our state. And part of that is what we hear a lot from our political leaders around affordability. That's one one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is incomes. Is we need jobs, and we need economic activity that drive incomes up as well for the average people, for everyday Vermonters.
But we participated in a session, was it last night, night before, where all of the participants talked about housing and the cost of housing, and Let's Build Homes, run by Moreau. And it's not necessarily that any of the people that are building these homes or doing the construction or owning the companies that build them. The cost of the land and the material and the complication of trying to get permits from 7 or 8 or 9 different locations in order to be able to get it, built and then approved and then on the market is complicated.
Yeah.
And cost of labor too, is not just materials, it's cost of labor also, and labor supply.
Yep.
And I saw the state's doing a cool project where they've put some home designs up.
Yes.
So folks who want to be building new can, shave a few $1,000s off by getting these pre-code. So, which also brings me to this, is the way forward these little reforms? We had S-190, which was maybe going to save us some money that the governor vetoed, even though it was a bipartisan bill.
Yeah,
but
the health care bill.
The health care bill.
Yeah.
So, these are these reforms that shave away. It's kind of like, looking at a budget and are you going to cut, your postage?
Yeah.
Or are you going to say, let's rethink how we're doing this work and how we're funding it from the get-go?
Yeah, absolutely, and changing the whole ecosystem around it. And when you talk about housing, we've talked with a lot of developers who are the people building the housing, and part of the challenge is, if you're being pitched 2 different projects, the affordable, $400,000 house that average household could afford is a lot less lucrative for builders than the $1 million house that someone from out of state wants to build, because the amount of time and labor, you have to build 3 of those in order to get the same of the $400,000 houses to get the same margin that you get on a $1 million house.
Which may be the second home.
Which is probably the second home. Yeah.
It's not going to be generating the local revenue.
So we need a paradigm shift because that's where the labor force is going, is those high-end homes, and so we need to figure out how to make those $350,000, $400,000 homes viable again, because the market's not doing that right now. And so it's things like the 802 Homes program, where it's pre-permitted, you can build, here's 10 designs, they're pre-permitted anywhere in the state. We haven't quite gotten that far yet. They meet all the zoning requirements and the construction requirements and everything, but you still have to get your permits for all of those things. But if we can make it so that you only need to get 3 permits instead of 9 permits,
bingo.
That does accelerate housing and bring the cost down. Some of the estimates from folks are that the permitting process itself, depending on what you're building, adds another $35,000 in cost on building a single unit of housing. And if you think about someone trying to build a $400,000 house, that's almost 10% of your cost just in the permitting process. And
what is the biggest cost driver? What's the biggest drain on Vermonters' pockets?
Across the board?
Yeah.
I think it's still housing. Healthcare certainly is a problem, but it's so expensive to live in Vermont now that I think that is the biggest drain when you look at the financial burden. Number 2 is probably healthcare. Number 3 is probably food or energy costs. Those 2 are fairly in line with each other. And we actually did this about 10 years ago. We started categorizing some of those things of okay, when you look at the average person's household budget, what are some of the biggest cost drivers and what rates are each of those cost drivers growing at on a quarterly basis or an annual basis. We call it our economic indicators report. And we kind of stopped publishing that because the state started doing they have a needs budget that they now publish, the legislature publishes through the JFO, and they do it once a year, and they look at sort of similar things, like what does the average household cost in each of those categories. And so we'd sort of stopped looking at that ourselves because the legislature was starting to do some of that work. So they call it the needs budget or something like that. I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, but.
Well, we are now we've just taken over the time, but what do you want folks to know about Campaign for Vermont as we wrap up, and how do they learn more about it? We're in an elevator together. What's the most important thing for me as a fellow Vermonter to know about the work that you're doing?
Just the facts, ma'am. You can trust the information. I think, fundamentally, as we have the opportunity to listen to the conversation just now, it is just the facts. And if you go to campaignforvermont.org and look it up and take a long, hard look at any of the different issues that have you and do some reading, you can.
Being a member allow you to weigh in on the policy? Is that, you said you had 20,000 members. Are you looking for more members?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. We want more people involved, always.
You don't have to pay a fee to be a member.
Yeah, you can choose to be a supporting member or a non-supporting member. It's kind of like the Vermont Public model. It's like you can be a member and you can be a supporting member. And we do ask our members for input. So whether that is sometimes we have like two options we're weighing on a particular policy situation, and we'll put out a internal survey to the members saying, hey, what do you think about these options? And outside of that, we often ask for feedback. In our newsletters, like, hey, if you have an idea on how to approach this problem or have feedback on this approach that we're considering, send us an email, talk to us. And then also our door is always open for folks that want to weigh in with an idea. And, we put that in the list of things that we consider and weigh it against all the other ideas that have been submitted or that our advisory council has brought to us. And again, it comes back to, for us, it's the ideas that matter. The policy, the policies themselves are the thing that matter, not the person who's proposing them necessarily, where it comes from.
Well, thank you both, Ben Kinsley, Pam Mackenzie. Thank you for being here.
Thank
you for
you.
sharing with folks what's going on with Campaign for Vermont. And thank you all for watching. Be well.